It wasn't the crown that cracked, it was the silence that followed. In the echoing halls of a palace older than memory, something shifted. Not with fanfare, nor fury, but with a look. A look that said, enough. Somewhere between the marbled silence of Buckingham and the ivy-covered calm of Clarence, a line was drawn. Not in law, not in public, but in something far older. Blood. What happens when the heir to a 1,000-year institution decides the monarchy must be defended? Not from enemies at the gate, but from shadows within its own walls. What happens when loyalty no longer means obedience, and tradition becomes a shield too heavy to carry? There are corridors in the royal residence where the paintings seem to lean in, as if listening. Ancestors in oil and gold frame look down with judgment, with warning, with memory. It was in one of those corridors, long, narrow, watching, that something unspoken passed between two figures. One was a future king, the other a woman long regarded as controversial royalty, once embraced, now watched with increasing unease. No words were recorded, no press release followed, but something was taken, not stolen, not revoked by Parliament, but quietly removed, as only those born into power can do. A title, a role, a place, not by decree but by decision. An inheritance of silence passed down not through ceremony, but through choice. The palace did not tremble. No marble cracked, no crowns fell, but those who know, who watch, felt it, like a draft through closed doors, like a whisper behind a curtain. This was not the clash of kingdoms. This was a colder war, fought in glances, in withheld greetings, in chairs suddenly left empty. And at the center of it, a man not just born into duty, but shaped by grief, who remembered too much, who had seen his mother cry in silence, who had been trained to bow, to smile, to stand still, until the moment came when standing still became a kind of betrayal. In that moment, he did not raise his voice, he simply rose, and in doing so, he began to rewrite everything. Evening settled over Clarence's house like a velvet curtain, quiet, regal, unyielding. The lights were low, golden but cool, casting long shadows against walls lined with ancestral faces. A fire cracked softly in the hearth of the drawing room, but its warmth could not chase away the chill in the air. It wasn't the kind of chill born of winter, but of history, of memory, and of something beginning to come undone. King Charles sat by the window, his fingers lightly drumming the edge of a porcelain teacup. He looked older that evening, thinner, quieter, the weight of both crown and years heavy on his frame. His gaze lingered on nothing in particular, perhaps the garden below, perhaps a ghost. Camilla stood nearby, her posture composed but her tone clipped, assertive, comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. In her hand, she held a folded briefing paper for the next day's engagement, but her attention was elsewhere, hovering, circling. There was a confidence in her that had only grown since the coronation, a certainty that time had finally rewritten her image in stone, that the worst storms had passed. And then William entered the room. He didn't speak at first, he rarely did. A nod to his father, a curt greeting to Camilla. He remained standing, deliberately, like a guard rather than a guest. The air shifted. What happened next didn't make the headlines. It didn't need to. The people in that room would never forget it. Camilla turned toward the king, holding the schedule between two fingers, and said something, low, sharp, too casual, a comment, a joke, perhaps even a mimicry of Charles's absent-mindedness, harmless to some. But in that silence, cutting, William caught it. He wasn't meant to, but he did. His father did not react. He stared out the window, unfazed or unaware. But William's jaw tightened, a flicker of muscle, a shift in breath. He looked not at Camilla, but through her. Then slowly his eyes turned to his father. There was no anger in them, only recognition. Recognition of something old, familiar. The same way a child learns to recognize the sound of glass breaking behind a closed door. Camilla smiled lightly, as if nothing had passed. She moved toward the mantel, lifting a crystal decanter. The silence in the room deepened, thickened. William did not move. He watched her as one would watch someone place a hand where it did not belong. Then he spoke, just once, one sentence, calm, level. Some things aren't funny. Camilla froze, the glass halfway to being poured. Her smile faltered just enough to register. She turned slowly, her face composed but her eyes narrowing. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said lightly, with a laugh that failed to land. And then Charles coughed, a small dry sound, but it broke the moment like a thread snapping in tension. He didn't look up. William stepped closer. still composed, still royal. But in that step, something had shifted. A line had been crossed, or perhaps finally acknowledged. Camilla returned the glass to the tray without drinking. She said nothing further. The fire hissed faintly. Outside, the lamps along the mall flickered on. From the hallway, a member of staff passed by, paused, and moved on. The door remained slightly ajar. It was over in moments. No shouting, no scandal, just a stare that lingered too long, a silence that refused to reset, and a boundary finally drawn, not as heir, not as prince, but as son. Later, an aide would say, there was something in the air after that night, like someone had moved the furniture just slightly, and no one dared put it back, because the moment itself was quiet. But in the monarchy, it is the quiet things that thunder the loudest, and that night Clarence House did not sleep easy. We knew something had shifted. You could feel it in the corridors. The palaces, regal, silent, unmoving, are rarely surprise. Their walls have witnessed abdications, affairs, wars cloaked in lace and tea, but even they seemed to pause in the days that followed that evening at Clarence House. Not outwardly, not in any way that could be photographed or recorded, but inwardly, in the way staff began to whisper again, in the way diaries were suddenly cleared of joint appearances, and in the way aides began avoiding certain hallways. No official statement was issued. There never is. But the most seasoned aides could feel it, a shift in gravitational pull. Something had broken, or perhaps something that had been straining for years had finally snapped, not with noise but with stillness. One royal correspondent, speaking off the record, noted, "We've seen rose before, we've seen frostiness, but this was different. This was structural, foundational, like something was being rewritten beneath the surface." From behind the scenes, details began to emerge, not shouted but passed carefully from one trusted source to another, like heirlooms too fragile to drop. In a meeting scheduled 2 days after the Clarence incident, William reportedly entered Kensington Palace's communications suite with one directive: clarity. The brief that followed was minimal but loaded. One line stood alone. Effective immediately, Her Majesty the Queen Consort is no longer to be used in internal communications. Just like that, a name was erased, not from law, not from public ceremonies, but from the living, breathing bloodstream of the firm. Memos were reworded, calendars adjusted, seating charts quietly revised. A former lady-in-waiting who had served the late Queen Elizabeth confided, "This was not rage, it was stewardship, the kind of decision Her Majesty would have made with a nod and never a word more." Another senior staffer who had worked under both Charles and his mother whispered through clenched discretion, "He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. That's what made it terrifying." The palace itself became a character, old, cold, observant. It doesn't breathe, but it listens. And in those days, it listened harder than usual. Staff exchanged glances more than words. The hum of the palace printers seemed louder. Even the guards, usually stoic, stood with a different kind of alertness. At Windsor, one of Charles's most trusted advisors reportedly advised delaying a joint appearance between the king and queen for an upcoming charity visit. Unwise optics, they said, given the prince's stance. It was the first time in years the schedule had been shifted not for health, but for politics of the heart. Camilla's name remained on the official website, but internally her status began to feel provisional, fragile, a title held not by right, but by tolerance, a tolerance that had reached its end. At Highgrove, servants were instructed to redirect calls from a particular line. Charles was seen walking the gardens longer than usual, not speaking, just walking. The monarchy, for all its gold and ceremony, is not ruled by thrones. It is ruled by temperature, by what's said behind doors, not at podiums. And that week, the temperature dropped, because something had changed the room. And now the room fight was changing everything else. He didn't sleep that night, not truly. The sheets were turned down, the room darkened, but Prince William lay still, eyes open, mind racing. Outside, the wind rustled the ivy against the stone. Inside, the storm was quieter, but far more dangerous. He had lived his life in the shadows of portraits, speeches, duty, raised not just to serve the monarchy, but to become it. But there was something deeper running through his blood, not just tradition, but memory. And that memory had its own voice. That night it had been loud. He saw her again. Not her face, time had faded that, but the gestures, the patterns, the way kindness could be weaponized, the way silence could become violence. He saw it again, not the face, but the pattern. Diana, the soft voice she used to calm him after a tabloid storm, the way she paused when asked about trust, the look in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. William had seen that look once in Clarence's house. He had seen it again, years later, in a different woman's smirk. Now he sat in his study, long after the embers in the fireplace had cooled. A leather-bound journal lay open on his lap. The pen hovered. The words didn't come easily, not because he lacked them, but because he knew what writing them down would mean. She thinks the crown protects her, he finally scribbled, but it was always father who did, even when it hurt him. That was the heart of it. Charles, a man bruised by life, never fully understood, never quite forgiven, had carried both love and burden for too long, and William had watched, quietly, respectfully, for decades. But there comes a moment when watching becomes complicity. Catherine had seen it in his eyes when he returned that evening. She didn't ask at first. She never needed to. But hours later, when they crossed in the hallway, she paused, hand on his arm, voice soft. "Is this about her?" He didn't answer directly. He just looked at her, and she nodded because she knew. "It's not just about what she said," he murmured. "It's about what she's always said, what she's always done, and what he's always allowed." She stood quietly beside him, not urging, just listening. That was her strength, not guiding him toward power, but helping him remember where his own was. William had never wanted a fight. He had grown allergic to them. But this wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning, not for revenge, but for restoration. Was it betrayal to act against the queen consort? Was it disloyalty to question the woman the king had loved so stubbornly? Or was it, at long last, an act of protection, not just for the monarchy, but for the man behind it? In that still moment, he understood. The institution could survive scandal. It had, many times, but it could not survive rot. Not from within, not again. And so with the same quiet determination that had once seen him walk behind his mother's coffin, he made another silent vow. He would not lose his father the way he had lost his mother. To silence, to image, to a system that waited too long to act. The storm in his chest did not pass, but it settled, not in peace but in purpose. And in that purpose, he found his voice. The monarchy has long understood the power of silence. Words can be twisted, but gestures whisper truth. And in the days that followed the quiet rupture behind palace doors, the public began to feel that silence, unsettling, deliberate, sharpened by its restraint. Camilla appeared first, a scheduled engagement at a countryside hospice, small, ceremonial, routine. But the briefing notes sent to royal correspondents that morning carried a single omission that set seasoned eyes on edge. Her Majesty Queen Camilla was gone. In its place, simply, the Duchess of Cornwall will be attending. A mistake? Unlikely. The palace doesn't make such errors, not in writing, and certainly not in titles. At the event, Camilla smiled. She always did. But this time, the smile clung too long to her lips and not enough to her eyes. As she cut a ribbon and shook hands, photographers captured her usual grace. Yet beneath it, an unease threaded its way into the fabric of the moment. The glance over her shoulder, the tightness in her jaw, the quiet between sentences. 2 days later, William appeared at a royal garden party. Alone. Catherine was said to be tending to private family matters, an absence notable but not alarming. What did stir conversation, however, was a simple sartorial detail. William's tie, navy silk, modestly patterned in white dots. But royal watchers remembered it. The very tie Diana had gifted him at 17, one of the few pieces he kept in personal storage. He hadn't worn it in over a decade. Until now. He did not smile widely. He did not linger in conversation. He walked the line of dignitaries with the grace of his station, but the steel of a son newly unyielding. Beside him, aides moved briskly. Cameras clicked. Not once did he so much as glance toward the press. Meanwhile, Charles resumed public duties at Windsor, present but altered. Observers noted a tremor in his left hand as he signed the ceremonial guest book. A subtle thing, easily missed. But in a family where every movement is measured, it mattered. And Camilla? At a veterans' luncheon the following week, she arrived alone. She gave a toast, charming and light. But midway through, she looked briefly toward the back of the room, as if expecting a signal, a glance, an anchor. It did not come. When official palace photographs from the event were released, eagle-eyed analysts noted the staging. William and Charles appeared in separate frames. No shared moments, no overlapping smiles. Camilla stood farther to the side than usual. The distance between them, physical, symbolic, had become measurable. In tabloids, headlines speculated. In forums, observers guessed. But the monarchy itself said nothing. Because in the firm, silence is not absence, it is strategy. And when it deepens, it tells you everything you're not supposed to know. The gestures stopped. The warmth dimmed. What remained were cold optics and unspoken statements. The royal machine didn't flinch. It froze. And in that freeze, in the carefully curated smiles and awkward silences, a nation watched a family unravel, frame by frame. Long before the silence fell over Clarence House, there was a different silence. A heavier one. A silence that echoed through televisions, across dining tables, and into the hearts of millions watching a fairy tale fall apart. In '94, then Prince Charles sat across from a journalist in what would become one of the most infamous interviews in modern royal history. With a tired voice and a troubled heart, he confirmed what many had suspected. Yes, he had been unfaithful to Diana. Yes, it had been Camilla. The betrayal was not just of marriage, but of myth. The Golden Prince, the people's princess. The fairy tale turned footnote. And while the world reeled, one boy sat quietly, watching from within the storm. William. Barely a teenager, but old enough to remember the headlines, the whispers at school, his mother's tears. He may have forgiven, but he never forgot. Camilla's rise from scandal to sovereign was nothing short of extraordinary. Slowly, deliberately, she moved from tabloid villain to reluctant consort, then finally to queen. Each step was choreographed, framed in duty, softened by time. But every ascent comes with a shadow. And in this case, it was the memory of a woman whose face still appeared in windows, charity halls, and the hearts of the people. This was never just about titles. Not really. This was about history, a reckoning 30 years in the making. For William, removing Camilla's title wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an act of restoration, a silent correction of a legacy rewritten in pain. And history, as it so often does within the monarchy, circled back. Just as Edward VIII's love for a divorced American had forced an abdication, just as Princess Margaret's heartbreak was sacrificed at the altar of public duty, private choices had once again collided with the crown's cold expectations. Because in this family, the personal is always public, and the past is never buried, only delayed. And now, at last, it had returned, not in scandal, but in silence, not as revenge, but as balance. The monarchy does not forget, and neither does its future king. The room was small by royal standards, one of those side chambers in St. James's Palace, paneled in wood, lit by a single wall sconce. The kind of room not listed on floor plans but always known by those who matter. The door was shut, locked. No aides, no photographers, no public. Inside, just three figures, William, Charles, and one silent witness. Either Catherine seated calmly in the corner, her presence a stabilizer, or perhaps a trusted senior aide, stationed like a human ledger, remembering every unspoken word. The tension wasn't immediate. It didn't arrive with footsteps or raised voices. It had been building for years, in glances avoided, in loyalties strained, in duties performed through gritted teeth. But tonight it had form, shape, finality. The room was quiet except for the dull ticking of a mounted clock. William stood, hands at his sides, gaze fixed not on the man before him, but on the idea of him, the father, the king, the figure whose legacy he was tasked to inherit, and now, to protect. "This ends now," said the voice behind the door. The voice was level, clipped, unmistakably firm. It didn't tremble. Charles sat, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, the other lightly grazing the bridge of his nose, a gesture of thought, or perhaps fatigue. He didn't look at his son immediately. Perhaps he couldn't. The weight of two roles, father and monarch, rested uneasily on his shoulders, and now they were at odds. There was no mention of Camilla by name, no list of offenses, no recitation of the cruel remark, the years of whispers, the history buried under titles and tapestries. William did not need to explain. Charles knew. He always had. What William offered was not a request. It was a realignment. This family will not be mocked from within. It was not shouted. It did not need to be. The authority came not from rage, but from clarity, from a sense of something bigger than reputation, legacy, and the feeling that if nothing changed, everything would. The proposal, if it could be called that, was simple. The quiet removal of Camilla's usage of queen in all internal briefings and international references. No press release, no public demotion, just silence. A vanishing, a signal to those who understood how power moves in palaces, not in speeches, but in wording, in formatting, in where one is seated and where one is not. Charles looked up. His face, for a flicker of a moment, softened, the father surfacing beneath the crown. He opened his mouth to speak, but then stopped. Perhaps the words weren't there, or perhaps the choice had already been made for him. Because the truth is, kings don't always decide. Sometimes the heirs do. Catherine, if she was present, remained still, eyes lowered, a silent pillar. She had watched her husband carry the weight of two parents, watched him walk behind his mother's coffin as a child, and now watch him carve a future from that pain as a man. There was no need for signatures, no written decree. The monarchy is built on precedent, not proclamation. Charles, ever the man of compromise, finally nodded, barely. It was the kind of movement only those raised in palaces could read. A flicker, a surrender, a choice, and the room did not erupt. There was no shouting, no blame hurled or accusations thrown, only the sound of the clock ticking and the quiet rearrangement of a royal narrative. And then, silence. Camilla's name would remain in programs. She would still curtsy, still wave. But within the machinery of monarchy, in the places that matter, her presence would begin to fade, not erased, just adjusted. And as William turned to leave, he did not look back, because the line had been drawn, and what followed now would no longer be his to explain. Change came not with a royal announcement, but with a slow, almost imperceptible shift, like the tide rolling back in the dead of night, unnoticed by all but those who lived by its pull. It began in the smallest places. Commonwealth offices abroad, accustomed to receiving official correspondence bearing the Queen Consort's formal sign-off, suddenly noticed an omission. Camilla's name no longer appeared beneath the king's. No explanation, no memo, just a blank space where once there had been two signatures. Then came the subtle but deliberate edits to the Royal Freight website. Sections once introducing Camilla as Her Majesty the Queen Consort were quietly updated to refer to her simply as the Duchess of Cornwall. The changes went live in the early hours of a weekday morning when few eyes were watching, but the digital record had shifted forever. The event seating charts told their own story. At a state dinner welcoming a European monarch, place cards were laid out with meticulous care, as they always are. Observers noticed Camilla seated 2 chairs farther from Charles than she had been at similar dinners just months earlier. Her position adjusted in line with the precedence of a duchess, not a queen. It was at Remembrance Day that the signal became impossible to ignore for those who knew what to look for. Each senior royal wears a royal family order, a ribbon and miniature portrait of the sovereign, bestowed personally. Camilla's, which she had worn proudly since before the coronation, was conspicuously absent from her lapel. Cameras flashed, catching every detail, yet she carried on, eyes straight ahead, smile fixed. The public saw only a well-dressed woman in black, but royal watchers saw a symbol removed. And still no statement came. Speculation bloomed. Headlines danced carefully around the words demotion and rift. Pundits debated timing, tone, what it meant for Charles's health, what it might signal for the monarchy's future. Yet Kensington Palace and Clarence House offered only the same line they had mastered long ago. No comment. Amid the silence, another figure began to rise. Catherine appeared more frequently by William's side, not with pomp, but with quiet presence. At hospital visits, charity events, and military ceremonies, her poise spoke volumes. She did not overshadow him. She steadied him. The contrast was unmistakable. Where others once stepped forward to claim the stage, Catherine simply stood, and in standing, became the monarchy's unspoken center. Even palace insiders, those most skilled at never revealing what they see, could not deny what was happening. One described it succinctly. Power didn't shout, it whispered, and everyone listened. In the weeks that followed, Camilla retreated into fewer engagements, focusing on private visits and long weekends at Ray Mill House. Charles, meanwhile, appeared more somber in his outings, still regal, but carrying a quiet weight that hadn't been there before. It was not a coup, it was not a scandal in the tabloid sense, but in a family defined by hierarchy, titles, and unspoken codes, these small shifts amounted to a transformation, a recalibration of who truly held influence, of who was trusted to preserve not just a crown, but a legacy. And as the monarchy settled into its new arrangement, the world watched, knowing something had changed, even if no one dared say exactly what. There would be no memoirs, no breaking interviews, no leaked emails or palace press briefings. What unfolded in those months would not become a scandal, but a study in restraint, in calculated silence, in the kind of authority that doesn't announce itself, but remains undeniable. William never raised his voice. He never penned a letter for the public to read. He simply acted, with precision, with memory, and with the weight of an entire legacy on his back. The act itself was not explosive. It was subtle, almost invisible to those who weren't watching closely. But within palace walls, walls that have witnessed wars, abdications, and centuries of fracture, the shift was seismic. Camilla quietly pulled back. Fewer engagements, no more solo tours. The title once affixed to her name in gold embroidery, now quietly archived in museum glass. She didn't vanish. She simply stepped aside. And in doing so, she preserved whatever dignity she could salvage. Charles, still king, still dutiful, appeared changed. There was a softness to him now, not weakness, but wear. The toll of a father torn between two worlds, between the love that once cost him everything and the son determined not to let history repeat itself. He resumed his duties with quieter eyes, a slower pace, a guarded presence that hadn't been there before. His reign continued, but its center of gravity had shifted. Because now the unspoken center of the monarchy was William. He didn't crown himself. He didn't need to. It was in how the aides turned to him in briefings, how diplomats watched him at receptions, how Catherine stood just slightly ahead when no one else noticed. It was in the way the monarchy now breathed, not through declarations, but through direction. And history? It always notices, not right away, not with headlines or hashtags, but with time, with the long view of kings and sons, of traditions broken not for power, but for protection. Because one day, when the historians sit to write the chapter titled The Quiet Reformation, they will remember this season not for what was said, but for what wasn't. They said nothing, and in doing so, rewrote everything.